Guy Badot, better known under the pen name Badot, was born in Montreal in the early years of the baby boom era. He was a student at Cégep du Vieux-Montréal, probably on the opening year of the Cégeps. We're not sure one or the other, because as we always say, if you remember the 1970s, it's because you were not there. And so, after a trip to Europe in 1971, he finally decided to become a cartoonist. He started in the business by producing comics for counterculture magazines of the time. Mémisse, Le Temps Fou, and Balloon, which I don't know, but I think it was an insert in Mémisse. He collaborated on the creation of Crow magazine in 1979 with the late Jacques Urtubise. And his caricaturist career started in the financial section of the Gazette daily newspaper. Then he switched to Le Devoir newspaper's art section. Those who were here during my discussion with Jacques Godbout will remember the wonderful caricature of Godbout by Badot, which was published in Le Devoir. Godbout had proudly commented on it. In May 1981, Badot adopts Ottawa and begins his brilliant career at Droit. He has won numerous awards: the National Newspaper Awards for the Best Editorial Cartoon, the Robert Lapalme Award for the 1001 Faces exhibition, the Award of Excellence of Editorial Cartoon Competition of the Association of Correspondents to the UN. He was the founder of the Association of Canadian Editorial Cartoonists, an association he's chaired for 5 years. He was also the editor of the annual portfolio magazine, The Year's Best Canadian Editorial Cartoons, for 22 years, from 1985 to 2007. As a matter of fact, you can admire one of the copies of this magazine, which is shown in the exhibition here in the room. Badot is also active in Cartooning for Peace, Drawings for Peace, an international network of cartoonists who fought for the respect of cultures and freedoms with humor. The Fund Badot of Library and Archives Canada has the romantic name of Fund R5791. It consists of 2,439 drawings and 83 photomechanical reproductions, a gold mine, built up over time, staggered through deposits from 1993 to 2007. Therefore, I would like to acknowledge and thank the archivist of LAC who is responsible for the Badot Fund, Marie Margaret Johnston Miller, who is with us this afternoon. Hello. And Guy Badot, your turn. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation. So let's draw your portrait before we wallow in the cartoons. A little history. It must not be obvious for a young man to declare that he wants to make a career as an artist in the early 1970s. Normally, the parents, especially mine, but many other parents have said to their young aspiring artist, begin by practicing law or medicine. Then later, if you want, you may turn to the arts. So in your case, how did this happen?
Well, I've started my classical studies, but the classical course shattered beneath my feet because I have failed in Latin. I was very bad in Latin, and in those days, if you failed one subject, you failed everything. So the second year, well, I drew in my books all year because I had succeeded the other subjects. My mother wanted me to be an architect. She wanted me to become an architect, but I was also horrible at chemistry. Physics were okay, but chemistry was a whole different story. So drawing kind of established itself. And then I said I was going to study at Cégep du Vieux-Montréal. But I'm very lucky, because in my family, we don't have the same name. But from my mother's side, there were a few artists. My great-grandfather was Laïs-Philippe Hébert, who left monuments everywhere. All monuments outside the Parliament in Quebec. The Native American family, the Maisonneuve Monument at the Place d'Armes in Montreal, etc. Besides, Evangeline is my grandmother, who posed for Evangeline in Longpré. Well, she did not pose in Longpré, but the statue, which is now in Longpré, was completed by the brother of my grandmother. So there is also Henri Hébert. He worked with Ernest Cormier, who has done lots of work. The Door of the Senate is a work of Henri Hébert. and his brother, both sons of Louis Philippe. He was called Adrien, and I knew Adrien because he died when I was 18 years old. So I saw him paint during the summer, and I inhaled the smell of turpentine in his studio. It smelled like oil paint. It smelled pretty strong.
But then there was no problem being an artist in the family. It was a rather wealthy family of artists.
Well, yes.
So you're at the Cégep du Vieux. I imagine you as a rebellious young man. You work at Mée-Mise, and then we'll see you in the financial pages of the Gazette, and then in the very prestigious newspaper Le Devoir. How do these transfers work?
Well, the Gazette, it happened. I also happened to play music at the time, and I played the harmonica with Claude Dubois, who lived on St. Paul Street in Old Montreal. There was an Aislinn exhibition at the One-of-a-Kind Gallery. So I've met Aislinn on that occasion.
He's a caricaturist at the Gazette.
Of the Gazette. Now, at the time, he was working for Montreal Star. It still existed. So I met Aislinn, who went to Europe, and then, I've met with him again in Europe. And then when I came back, he told me there was an opening in the finance section of the Gazette. This is because in the finance section of the Gazette, there was always a notice saying such and such a person was appointed to such and such a position, and there was a section called Character Sketch, which was written and illustrated by Luke Collins, who has left to go to the Gazette. So the Star was looking for someone to replace him. So this is what I did for a year and a half or so. I was with a journalist. I attended the interview with the journalist, and then I made a caricature that was printed in the Gazette. President of Molson, Hydro-Quebec it was. And then they had a survey every 6 months, and it became the favorite section of the Gazette's readers. Was it in the Star?
The Gazette.
We were at the Gazette. Because in the meantime, Terry had left the Star to go to the Gazette. So I was asking for a pay increase every time. I started at $35, then it became $40, then $50.
For the hour?
No, for the drawing. And at a certain point, someone told me that Le Devoir was looking for a cartoonist. And the director of Le Devoir of the art section at that time was Robert Guy Scully, who was about my age or slightly younger than me. And then, this is where I've done the caricature of Jacques Godbout, etc. So I found it to be more interesting, because after a certain point, drawing businessmen becomes redundant. Well, redundant is not the right word, but you understand. Well, it's less exciting than to draw writers, because Le Devoir opened me all the doors. I could go to the writer. So I have met Jacques Godbout just like that one day. I spent an evening at his place, Michael Garneau.
But, so you exclusively drew authors at Le Devoir?
At Le Devoir? Yes.
Okay.
Yes. It was on the first page of the art section. Actually, Scully wanted me to be like David Levine of Le Devoir. It was somewhat modeled on David Levine's work in New York Review of Books. So I found it but the only problem is that I had requested $75, I've left the Gazette. I had made 1, 2, 3, I had gone up to 6 caricatures. But they paid me at the end of the month. And it was Claude Ryan who was the director of Le Devoir. So the first check I have multiplied by 75, And then I get my check. It was quite a change. I had returned to my original fare, $35. I traveled back in time like 5 years.
So that was the weekly salary?
It was 1 per week, yes.
$35?
Yeah.
Is it worth the trouble to ask why you changed? No. Tell me, before we start discussing the newspaper Droit, cartooning for peace, what was the thought behind it? We see a drawing, but to think that drawing will create peace, it's clearly a leap of faith.
Yes.
You have to explain.
Let's say that it was Plan 2's initiative. Plan 2 was the caricaturist in Monde, and I think he has met with Yasser Arafat and Shimon Peres. Then he made them sign a declaration, a map, Israel's division, the two countries. He was very optimistic, this Plan 2, but I think it came from a good intention. And I think it's important that people realize it, because it's easier to hate someone we don't know. And actually, the goal of Cartooning for Peace was to reunite cartoonists from around the world. Sometimes it's hard, especially because there are a lot of Arab countries. Some cartoonists said, if this Jew is going, I'm not going. But we must go beyond. So I met Bukhari, a Palestinian cartoonist, and then Kitchka from Israel. The initiative is rather francophone. It was founded, I think. The director who initiated it was Kofi Annan. So that's a grouping of cartoonists, but rather francophone. But I have also participated in Witty World in the 1970s. Witty World was a group of cartoonists. It was someone, a Hungarian, who wanted to create an international newspaper, and he made interviews with cartoonists from all over the world. The only problem was that, I was in Budapest in 1990. There was a huge exhibition, and then I spent the whole day with a cartoonist from New York and another cartoonist from Pakistan. The Pakistani told me that the price of one single copy of Witty World was the same price as a whole year at a Pakistani university. So what he was doing is that he took his own copy of Witty World, he photocopied it, and distributed it to everyone. So the newspaper didn't really have
I did not have adequate distribution.
No.
So how did you make it to Droit? When we left off, you were at Le Devoir. An opportunity presented itself?
I had another. So Le Devoir, it didn't last long. But the thing is that Scully left Le Devoir to go to Radio-Canada International. So I found myself, I had nothing left. And at that time, Terry said, "Oh, Le Jour is looking for a caricaturist." So I said, "Okay, Le Jour." It was Le Jour Hebdo. But I thought, So I've worked for them for I think Le Jour Hebdo lasted about 1 year and a half. And then I stopped, and Croc arrived. It was rather comics than caricatures at Croc. But the cartoonist, who was also Mikhail's colleague, died in 1980, around September. So Le Droit was looking for a caricaturist. They held an exam. We were 3 candidates, it seems like.
You've been selected.
Well, exactly.
And now we are 35 years later.
35 years, yes.
Always on the saddle. So, you've chosen 24 cartoons for us. They come from your fund, which is at Library and Archives Canada. You have chosen them for reasons that seem important to you. We will have a look together. Sometimes it's more aesthetic, sometimes it's more about politics. So let's go with the international subjects first. Lech Walesa from the Solidarność movement, who then became president of the Polish Republic. You make a pun because he had won the Nobel Peace Prize, and you make him say, "Dansk very much."
It was a little tricky to add an English pun in a French newspaper, but, well,
it was bilingual Polish.
Exactly. So we see him with his pencils, and I can't remember which Madonna. It's a Polish Madonna.
And there you decide there is the mustache that comes out of the nose. That's the trait you decided to emphasize.
The nose as well.
Yeah.
It's a bit complicated to draw frontal noses. It's like Bourassa. Doing frontal drawings, it's...
Besides, we will see that you have found a way to make a very famous personality look like Robert Bourassa. Let's continue. 26th of June, 1986, it's a drawing that is terrible because you evoke the explosion of an Air India plane, Flight 182, for those who remember. The route was Montreal, London, Delhi, and terrorists detonated it during the flight over Ireland. 329 victims, so up to the tragedy of 9/11. Until September 11th, it was the deadliest air tragedy. So for you, we will also speak about the drawing, because it is a very powerful one. You have something very personal related to this story.
Yes, well, obviously, the day it happened. It happened on June 26th, I think, 25th or 26th anyway. It was not far from Saint-Jean, and there was a teacher from Outaouais who was among the victims. So it became a local issue, effectively. So I did my drawing, and at the time, the Globe and Mail used to republish my drawings at the bottom of the page of the Saturday newspaper. And I think it's at that moment that my mother called to tell me that she was the one who sold the ticket to the perpetrator. She was working for Canadian Airlines in Vancouver, and, well, obviously, she parked her car on the side of the road when she heard that, you know. Air India explosion off the coast of Ireland. She said, "Oh my God, it must be my client." So she stops on the side of the road. She calls the office, and then to all investigators, she had to testify first, because she was the one who could make the connection between the two flights. So Air India exploded off the coast of Ireland, and another plane that had a stopover in Tokyo to fly to Delhi. And then they took out the luggage and then the porters. A suitcase exploded, which made 3 to 4 victims, Japanese baggage handlers. But she was the one who could link the two events, because she had sold those 2 tickets to the same person. So when the investigations take place, she has to testify first, because otherwise they could be accidents, 2 independent accidents. But the fact that the same person bought tickets for both events, we rather thought of conspiracy. It must be said that at the time, we could board a plane without, well, someone's luggage could board the plane without the person actually being present. There were no checks. So whenever I fly and I hear people whining, "Oh, how come we're still not leaving?" I say, "Well, you know, I prefer to wait until everybody's on board and they've searched everything."
It's like Le Crime d'Ovid Plouffe.
Yeah, it's similar.
Yeah, so in 1985, it's a caricature that addresses apartheid in South Africa. It's part of an exhibition called A View from the World from Ontario in 1989. So tell us, it is very simple and at the same time very powerful. What do we see?
Well, actually, we see a closed fist. And since it is a shadow, it's a black fist. And then, well, it was reproduced in a better quality because I think I did a photocopy. Anyway, the fact remains that it represented that the future is dark for white people in South Africa. I should have written that on the top.
He hands a bone.
He hands a bone, hoping it will satisfy, yeah. But it took more than a bone.
We'll continue because we have another allusion to South Africa, but this one is when Duvalier was ousted from Haiti. So we see in Greece, Switzerland, and Spain refusing him asylum, and he says, "I still have South Africa."
Yes, exactly. So another pariah country. But I do not think South Africa accepted. Yeah.
France did.
Yes, well, France has welcomed him with open arms. But his wife left him, and he lost anyway.
The story doesn't end well.
No.
Another one, another great pun, a terrible pun. J'ai fait fureur. Furor. In French, Kurt Waldheim has been elected. He had just been elected president of Austria, but during the electoral campaign, photos of him wearing a German military uniform during Second World War surfaced. So that was the joke around it. J'ai fait fureur.
Yeah, that's right. There were pictures leaked about him in the uniform of the Waffen-SS, and the drawing is the official photo of the news agencies. I may have exaggerated, but barely. I think the photographer did it on purpose to take his picture from that angle. So he was saluting. Yeah, a pun. I think I'm the victim. I make too many puns. I don't know. I'm looking at my boss, who is accustomed to
To your features.
my puns. Yeah.
Yes.
But I'm not the only one. Chapleau makes some too.
And there is also, who said it was the waste of the mind?
Yeah, it's Victor Hugo.
I think that's it.
He is not here with us to...
A pun is a fart of the mind, or the waste of the mind.
I think it's a good wordplay.
But he is not here this afternoon. The next one is also terrible. We didn't choose funny ones only. It's a map with a target, and this one was not done a few months ago. It's incredible. It was in 1986, Toddy store on Rue de Rennes. 7 victims dead in an explosion, but it's really fabulous because the first time we see it, we are mistaken and think it was last December.
Yeah. November 2015.
2015.
I get lost. There are so many dates to remember that...
But here the idea was, what intrigued me, well, we immediately understand that Paris is the target. What intrigued me is why you've given yourself so much trouble drawing all the streets, the great arteries. You've given yourself a great deal of work. I hope you were not paid $35 this time, because you've worked hard.
No, in 1986, I was earning a bit more than that. I had a weekly salary. The thing is, I don't like to draw bodies and blood. Well, firstly, the drawings are in black and white, so it's a little tricky to draw blood. It's in black and white. I don't like to add too much violence, especially in a drawing published in a newspaper that's for the whole family. So I thought it was maybe more... The message was understood anyway.
But this is not a cut and paste. You really drew this.
Yes, I traced.
The arteries.
Yes. All the streets are there. Even Canal Saint-Martin. Yeah. Well, it took the whole day. But tracing doesn't take too long. It's not as long as, imagining people takes way longer.
And you've told me you reused it recently? You've published it again?
I reused it in November 2015, except that, well, at that time, it was published in black and white. So I've redone it in color. And there, I've really enhanced Canal Saint-Martin. You can see Canal Saint-Martin in blue.
The next one, it's August 1991, and it is to illustrate the dissolution of the USSR. What we see is the fall of the statue of Lenin. Very few words. Change, of course, in the USSR.
Yes, well, in fact, I drew this in August. It was a bit more because I think that the Soviet Union fell in December. I think that's when people fled Austria to go to Hungary. But in August, a change happened. I think the shift is maybe... Anyway, I can't remember exactly. But in fact, this drawing represents the confusion of Eastern Europeans, a culture in which everything was decided by the state. The drama of the USSR is that after the Tsars, they experienced a brief period with Kerensky in 1914, where he had, or in 1917, where they had a real democracy. But it didn't last long because the Bolsheviks overthrew him. So there are people who have lived under oppression since the Middle Ages. And I think that we ask a lot of them, to adopt, to become democratic all of a sudden. In our case, it took time. There have been revolutions in France, the United States, there were all sorts of things. But it's a closed society. So actually what I wanted to say is that we overthrew communism and we look in the direction of that it's change, of course. In fact, I might have written new direction in USSR. But, well, anyway.
But we can see that your two May we call them your badauds?
Yeah, we can.
They are wondering where they're going, because he shows the direction over there, but we see that the eyes follow.
Exactly.
So effectively, there is a lack of benchmarks.
I had met a little anecdote and a Russian saying. I had met in Budapest precisely in the frame of the Witty World event. I had shared a room for 3 days with a Russian, Mikhail Zlatkovsky. In any case, those were 3 pretty intense days, because he told me all the purges in his family, etc. And then he told me an anecdote. It's a Russian saying. We would pretend to work, and they would pretend to pay us.
The next one is in July 1992. To give a little context, Saddam Hussein refuses the presence of humanitarian personnel of the United Nations in the territory of Iraq, and you illustrated it by suggesting that peacekeepers could change logo, and here we find your favorite target.
Well, I like to play with the logos, but I think this drawing could have been published today. No? They are giving supplies in Iraq.
So, a work on the logos.
In Syria. Humanitarian convoys were bombed yesterday, so things are very bad. At that time, it is the UN. They do whatever they can, but...
Under the word logo, is there something that you added? I see something paler. Did you use something?
Yes, I have glued.
Did you use something else?
Maybe, I don't know.
Another word?
I changed it, or maybe I wrote an acronym.
Oh,
You know, because often an acronym, a logo, it's a mistake. Well, that I don't do anymore. I may have made it in this case.
still analyzing the drawing and the technique, Bill Clinton's election to the U.S. presidency. You illustrate the challenge of the caricaturist who must always adjust, of course, depending on who is elected. But beyond this, adding Kennedy and Franklin Roosevelt, did you want to emphasize an intellectual kinship between them, or?
Well, in fact, they are Democrat presidents. I didn't want to add MVJ. I don't know. I think it's the first time I drew Kennedy. But hey, maybe it was, because there were all these bimbo alerts during the campaign. Well, maybe we weren't aware. We didn't know Kennedy's bimbos at that time. I don't know. But it was to say that he was not up to Kennedy or Roosevelt. And in fact, these were actually two drawings. It's clear, the lines. I was still working on that other drawing. In fact, I think this is a pencil drawing that I photocopied, and then I glued it there.
Then we didn't insist on the fact that you put a lot of work into it. We can see a lot of...
Well, there's a lot of work in the other two drawings. Yeah.
And you, obviously, you inherit these people. You don't have a choice. For example, are there certain people who are more difficult to draw than others at the present time?
Yes, there's Mélanie Joly.
Our minister.
She's not easy to draw.
Why is she...
Well, she has regular features, blonde hair. Let's hope she won't be too controversial.
To avoid having to draw her.
Yeah, exactly. We wish her a career.
Long and quiet.
Yeah.
Let's go back to South Africa, 10 years later than earlier. We are in 1995. Obviously, apartheid is now over. Nelson Mandela came to power. But his ex-wife, who was minister, has been accused of corruption. I can't remember, perhaps even murder, but that charge was not maintained. In any case, corruption. So we see that he finally got rid of the apartheid millstone, but the millstone of his ex-wife was even heavier.
Yeah, well, in fact, I think it was the football team. There was a young man who was killed in the entourage of, I don't know what her relationship was with that football team, if she owned the team, but that's it. So it was a source of embarrassment for...
With a file.
Yeah, well, exactly. He solved the problem and found another. I think they divorced. I'm not sure they were already divorced at that moment.
Well, it says X in your notes.
So the divorce had already taken place.
Already over. Let's dig into Canadian politics. The first one you've chosen comes from your beginnings at the Droit, and it's really... I think we can actually see it here. It's on display. It's a real piece of art. It's not something you've done rapidly. You wanted to highlight something special, which is the adoption of the new, the Constitution of Canada, I believe.
Repatriation.
Exactly. April 17th, 1982. Tell us a little more about the process.
So I took the famous picture Fathers of Confederation, and this is called New Fathers of Confederation. If we look at it carefully, we can see Trudeau on the left, and in the window behind, we can see René Lévesque. Anyway, we only see the top of his head with smoke coming out of. He's excluded because Quebec is excluded. And then on the right, standing in the middle, is Jean Chrétien. So I drew the premiers of the time. But since Jean Chrétien was the one who, with Roy McMurtry, who was right before him, who negotiated the agreement in the kitchen of the famous... So these are the prime ministers of the time. Lougheed on the left, etc.
Was this an insert?
Yes, it was an insert that the newspaper has produced. I even have a picture of people burning this insert to expose...
Expose what?
The adoption of...
Oh, the adoption. Well,
This is the first time one of my drawings was burned in public.
that's right. That's pride, joy for you. A reason for pride. Okay. Another gem of your imagination, the 1983 caricature that shows the dangers of bilingualism. In Ontario, it's the pipe of Bill Davis, and in Quebec, the cigarette of René Lévesque.
Well, I thought it was a humorous way to deal with the matter. In fact, this is the Anglophone minority in Quebec and the Francophone minority. Yes, this is the beginning of my... And I had a vertical format, so to draw the two was more complicated. But I found it funny to, one smokes a pipe, the other cigarettes. Besides, I recycled the symbol. I think it was when Parizeau succeeded René Lévesque. I recreated the painting by Michelangelo, God, who... And then there is René Lévesque, who lights Parizeau's cigarettes with the tip of his cigarette. Anyway, he's passing the torch. In any case, the finger touches the finger.
Yeah. Is that the decade 1976 to 1985? Was it a golden age for the caricaturists? You did not need to rack your brains to find subjects every day.
No, there were a lot of subjects. Well, when I was younger, when I was 9 to 10 years old in the early 1960s, I would not have wanted to be a cartoonist. Because on one side we had Eisenhower and Khrushchev on the other. Eisenhower and Khrushchev, they don't have hair. They don't have anything. While the 1960s, Trudeau, Lévesque, it was really... The period was extended with Claude Ryan. That was really ideal.
Oh, really? For caricaturists?
Well, first of all, he wasn't paying me enough, and I was angry. I was angry against him, even years later. But I must say that the Lévesque-Trudeau fight was epic. Like de Gaulle in France.
Precisely, in the end of that intense decade, the next caricature is a beautiful risk you took. It was the beginning of the end for René Lévesque, and he is, of course, with Brian Mulroney. And you just made me notice something. The musical notes you have chosen are very symbolic.
Well, it is not trivial. It's, I was forced to watch. I did not know. I don't read music. But it's a C chord. So if there's hope, but in any case it is, I mean, there are maybe only 3 people who understand it, but it doesn't matter.
Even after you explained it.
No, I'm not obliged to. But I wanted to add a little touch. I wanted to add a little something.
In 1985, the Canadian dollar is in free fall, and at the time, that was very new. And you illustrate it by using the face of the Queen and a quote. Queen Victoria saying, "We are not amused."
I believe so, exactly. Instead of leaving it empty, I thought I'd add a known text, a known quote. I think we were at 65 cents USD at that time.
And I've told you, I noticed that the Queen has the same nose as Robert Bourassa. If we have a look at the next picture, I think that... Yeah. So...
In short, so we see that Law 101. Always comes handy.
In 1986...
Yeah.
And, well, you didn't play with logos, but almost. You're now talking about the trap Bourassa will fall in.
I think it was the display. He was obliged to invoke the close.
Notwithstanding,
It was invalidated Meech.
in this case also, no difficulties with the caricatures?
No.
With Robert Bourassa.
Well, exactly. Bourassa was fun because I could draw his profile. It was, you know now, it's more complicated from the front. Me, that's why I was happy when Mulroney arrived, because Mulroney, I could draw him from profile or do a frontal portrait. Well, Jean Chrétien, his profile is pretty hard to draw because Jean Chrétien, it's the mouth that slides on the side. So if I draw his profile, we cannot see it. From one side, you see the whole mouth, and you don't see it from the other side. You know, so I always have to design the drawing in order to have the head of Jean Chrétien facing us. Well, Mulroney, well, he had an interesting nose, chin. He was good from profile, and he was good in frontal. It was great. You know, that was really a gift.
So, the next picture will prove you lied because you said that beautiful women are difficult to caricature, but did great. You did a great job. André Champagne, for those who are old enough to remember, Donalda, in Les Belles Histoires des Pays d'en Haut, she was, it's a really cruel caricature. André was Minister of State for Youth. It was the year of youth, and she had just cut the budgets. As Donalda would have said, the more things change, the more they stay the same, because she was living next to a tightwad.
Yeah, exactly. It was self-evident.
But you disfigured her a little bit. It allowed you to.
Yeah.
Benoit Bouchard, Minister of Transport in 1990. You played with the logos. There were cuts at Via Rail, and this is what you have done.
In fact, they had cutbacks. So it's like an accordion. You know, I looked at it and I thought, oh, it could be an accordion. It was a good idea and easy to... I like that.
Let's continue. Another pun. This one, I think, is a pun dictated by anger. Sault Ste. Marie, the city council decided that only English could be used when working for the city. This was at a time where this issue was a very delicate one, and it was not very smart to bring it up.
Yeah.
So therefore, there's a little anger when you use the term "sot," which means fools in English.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the city of Sault Ste. Marie that has decided to unilingual English. I don't know, was it connected to a referendum or something?
It happened in February 1990.
Yeah, I don't really know. Anyway, maybe it was connected. It was perhaps to take revenge for something that happened in Quebec. It happens often.
So, the next caricature, it's not a pun, it's a game of images. At a certain point, a moratorium on cod fishery in Newfoundland took place, and you have illustrated that by ancient fishing, modern fishing. So you take the same elements, except that here, the boat is in a dry dock, and instead of a net, it has a cobweb.
A spider web, yeah. Well, I found it interesting geographically. Now, if I had to do it again, I don't know if I would put the horizon of the bottom a bit higher. This way, it would be the same height as in the drawing, you know. It's like the game of the 7 errors, except that in this case, there are more than 7 differences. Graphically, I find it interesting because, you know, how can you illustrate shortage or the moratorium on fisheries? Anyway, it's a challenge. It's a daily challenge to try to find new images.
To illustrate concepts.
Yeah, that's it. Me, what I like the most are the drawings that have no text. This one has some text, but I think the ones without text are the most difficult to find.
In the text, Our Daily Shortcomings, if we go to the next drawing, that's the Charlottetown referendum. So here we have 3 specific cases. The French say liberty, equality, fraternity. Americans say we the people, and Canadians say we're waiting for a legal text.
I think there was a question concerning translation. Translation was expected. Unfortunately, we didn't have Google yet. Exactly.
So you found a somewhat exciting way, because the question was, do you agree that the Constitution of Canada should be renewed on the basis of the agreement reached on August 28, 1992? That wasn't very exciting. So you found a way to illustrate that case. Another referendum, 1995, and towards the end. I don't think anyone has forgotten that. It was very tight. And Jean Chrétien invited us to vote yes by saying da, like in Canada.
Bien, c'est ça. He was trying to find something, the campaign of the yes. What they did is they took the word Quebec, and then there was the U in Quebec that was the U, and then the first leg of the E was the I, and then they had removed the leg of the Q, so it became an O. It became we. Yes. We saw the words yes and Quebec at the same time. They were trying to find something interesting, but I must admit that it was Guy Gendron who gave me the idea of the joke. Yes, at Radio-Canada. And well, I managed to sign it in Russian as well.
Yes, it's true. It's a unique style. Yeah, exactly.
While we're at it.
Next one, it's still the same context. It is 4 days before the referendum, and it's not going well at all for the Federalist camp. So we see the leaves of the Canadian maple fall, and Chrétien is trying to catch them. And this is actually the first time we see this. We have 2 copies of the same drawing. The one that was published was the one with the dark leaves, the other one. So what is behind this work? What is the idea behind choosing one over the other?
Well, it's because at the time, the scanners arrived to the newspaper. We could scan, except as a member of the union, I didn't have the right to do so. First of all, I had no computer, etc., etc., etc. Still, there was someone, a technician, who was scanning the originals, but I was afraid of everything. I had already lost originals and taxis when I was a freelancer, so I was always afraid of, I always kept a drawing in reserve. So in this case, I did my drawing in black and white, without gray. And then I made a photocopy, and I colored the leaves with a gray marker and with a wax pencil. I drew the branches of the tree. So I had many, many drawings at that time. We had 2 of everything. There's a black and white version without gray, and then another version with gray tints. It's only because I figured that if I missed my shot, I'd be obliged to start all over again. It's hard to touch up the marker with gouache afterwards. On the right side, we can see that I've corrected. I took out some leaves. I had the impression that the situation was perhaps more critical than in my original drawing. And anyway, graphically, I found it more interesting.
The last one is also outstanding. Published a few days before the armistice of November 1992, when the siege of Sarajevo reached
Exactly.
its climax. So the war memorial is here in Ottawa. And you add, I'll let you say it. It's a quote from Santayana.
Actually, what I should have done was maybe those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Because in Serbia, we always return to the War of 1432. You killed my this, my that, then we got revenge, and then, in the Yugoslav conflict, we must remember that the Croats were on the Nazi side during World War II. They were against the communists. When Ribbentrop, the agreement, arrived, they possibly became allies. Anyway, it's a bit... But it was a general observation I made.
Yes, it wasn't referring to Sarajevo, but it was in the same context.
Yeah, exactly.
And truly, once again, you didn't try to be humoristic.
Well, it's November. It was a bit delicate.
Indeed, indeed.
It's not a day where...
No.
It's like September 11. September 11, on that same day, I did not draw a hilarious drawing. I drew the Statue of Liberty. I don't know if she was crying or not, perhaps. Well, in any case, except that the next day, I drew the debris of the Pentagon, and then in the debris, we could see the burned anti-nuclear shield, It was burning. That drawing was a bit more ironic, but on the same day, it's a bit tricky.